The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the small, forgotten town of Black Hollow. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the distant hum of cicadas filled the silence. It was the kind of place where time seemed to stand still, where the woods whispered secrets to those who dared to listen, and where children still played outside until the streetlights flickered on. 3 children, Emily, Jack, and Sarah, were inseparable. They spent their days exploring the woods, building forts, and inventing games that only they understood. Emily, the oldest at 12, was the leader, her sharp wit and fearless nature guiding the group. Jack, a year younger, was the dreamer, always with his head in the clouds but fiercely loyal. Sarah, the youngest at 10, was the heart of the trio, her wide-eyed innocence and boundless curiosity often leading them into trouble. That afternoon, they had decided to play a game of hide-and-seek in the woods. It was a place they knew well, or so they thought. The forest was vast, its dense canopy filtering the sunlight into a dim, greenish glow. The ground was soft with moss, and the air was cool, even in the late summer heat. It was the perfect place to disappear. "I'll count to 50, Emily declared, her voice echoing through the trees. No peeking. Jack and Sarah scattered, their laughter fading into the distance as they searched for the perfect hiding spot. Emily leaned against a tree, her eyes closed, counting aloud. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves replaced by an eerie silence. When Emily reached 50, she opened her eyes and began her search. The woods felt different somehow, the shadows deeper, the air heavier. She shook off the feeling, chalking it up to her imagination. She found Jack quickly, crouched behind a fallen log, his face smeared with dirt. They laughed together as they continued to search for Sarah. But Sarah was nowhere to be found. "Sarah," Emily called, her voice tinged with unease. "Come out, you win." The forest remained silent. "Maybe she went back home," Jack suggested, though his voice wavered. Emily shook her head. "She wouldn't do that. She wouldn't leave without us." They searched for what felt like hours, calling Sarah's name until their voices grew hoarse. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the woods grew darker, the shadows stretching like long fingers reaching out to grab them. The air grew colder, and a faint, acrid smell filled their nostrils, a smell that didn't belong in the forest. "Emily," Jack whispered, his eyes wide with fear. "Do you hear that?" Emily froze, listening. At first, there was nothing. Then, faintly she heard it, a low, guttury whisper coming from all around them. It was a language she didn't understand, but the tone was unmistakable. It was hungry. "We need to go," Emily said, grabbing Jack's hand. "Now." They ran, their feet pounding against the soft earth, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. The trees seemed to close in around them, their branches clawing at their clothes. Emily's heart raced as she realized they were lost. The path they had taken was gone, replaced by a labyrinth of twisted trees and 40 underbrush. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the whispers stopped. The forest was silent once more, but the air was different, thick, oppressive, as if the very fabric of reality had shifted. Sarah was gone. Chapter 2: The Search That Led to Horror. The police were called, and search parties combed the woods for days. But there was no trace of Sarah. No footprints, no torn clothing, nothing. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. The adults whispered among themselves, their faces pale and drawn, but they offered no answers. The children were questioned, their stories dismissed as the overactive imaginations of frightened kids. But Emily and Jack knew better. They had seen the shadows move, heard the whispers. They had felt the forest change around them, felt the presence of something ancient and malevolent. They couldn't explain it, but they knew. Sarah hadn't just disappeared. She had been taken. Days turned into weeks, and the town of Black Hollow tried to move on. But Emily and Jack couldn't. They spent every waking moment searching for answers, poring over old books and local legends, desperate for a clue. They avoided the woods, but the forest seemed to call to them, its whispers echoing in their dreams. One night, Emily woke to the sound of scratching at her window. She sat up, her heart pounding, and saw the figure standing outside, a small, pale figure with wide, empty eyes. It was Sarah. Emily screamed, and the figure vanished. She ran to Jack's house, and together they returned to the woods, armed with flashlights and a desperate hope. The forest was darker than ever, the trees looming like silent sentinels. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the ground was littered with strange symbols carved into the earth. "What is this place?" Jack whispered, his voice trembling. Emily didn't answer. She was too focused on the faint sound of singing, a child's voice, soft and melodic, coming from deep within the woods. They followed the sound, their flashlights cutting through the darkness, until they reached a clearing. In the center stood an ancient tree, its gnarled roots twisting like serpents, and there, at the base of the tree, was Sarah. But it wasn't Sarah. The figure turned to face them, and Emily's blood ran cold. It had Sarah's face, but its eyes were black voids, its mouth stretched into a grotesque smile. It reached out a hand, its fingers long and clawed, and whispered their names. "Emily, Jack, come play with me." They ran, the forest closing in around them, the whispers growing louder, more desperate. They stumbled and fell, their flashlights flickering until they burst out of the woods and into the safety of the town. They collapsed on the ground, gasping for air, their minds reeling. The next morning, they returned to the clearing with the police, but there was no sign of the tree, no sign of Sarah. The adults shook their heads, muttering about stress and trauma, but Emily and Jack knew the truth. The forest had taken Sarah, and it wasn't done with them. Chapter 3: The Truth That Should Have Stayed Buried. The days that followed were a blur. Emily and Jack were haunted by nightmares, their sleep plagued by visions of the forest and the thing that had taken Sarah. They tried to tell themselves it was just their imagination, but deep down, they knew better. The forest was alive, and it was hungry. One night, Emily found an old journal in her attic. It belonged to her great-grandfather, a man who had lived in Black Hollow his entire life. The pages were filled with sketches of the forest, of strange symbols, and of a tree with twisted roots. And there, in the margins, was a name: the Hollow Tree. According to the journal, the Hollow Tree was a gateway, a place where the veil between worlds was thin. It was said that those who entered the tree would be taken by the forest, their souls consumed by the ancient entity that dwelled within. The journal warned against ever seeking out the tree, but Emily knew they had no choice. They returned to the woods one last time, armed with the journal and a desperate determination. The forest was silent, the air heavy with anticipation. They followed the symbols carved into the earth, their flashlights cutting through the darkness until they reached the clearing. The hollow tree stood before them, its roots twisting like serpents, its branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, and there, at the base of the tree, was Sarah. But it wasn't Sarah. The figure turned to face them, its black eyes gleaming with malice, its mouth stretched into a grotesque smile. It reached out a hand, its fingers long and clawed, and whispered their names. "Emily, Jack, come play with me." Emily stepped forward, her heart pounding, and held up the journal. "We know what you are," she said, her voice trembling. "And we're not afraid of you." The figure laughed, a sound that echoed through the forest, and the ground beneath them began to shake. The tree's roots twisted and writhed, and the air grew thick with the smell of decay. Emily and Jack stood their ground, their flashlights flickering as the figure lunged at them. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the shaking stopped. The figure vanished, and the forest was silent once more. The hollow tree was gone, replaced by a patch of barren earth. Emily and Jack collapsed to the ground, gasping for air, their minds reeling. They had done it. They had faced the forest and survived. But as they made their way back to town, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The forest was silent, but the whispers lingered in their minds, a constant reminder of what they had faced. And as they reached the edge of the woods, they saw it. A small, pale figure standing in the distance, its wide, empty eyes staring back at them. It was Sarah. But it wasn't Sarah. The figure smiled, its mouth stretching in a grotesque grin, and whispered their names. "Emily, Jack, come play with me."